So the Scream franchise is kind of special, and I brought receipts. Hi, my name's Jakub, and I'm a guy who sometimes likes to use Excel spreadsheets to make sense of the movies he watches. And something tells me that today's one of those days. But before we go any further, do all the YouTube things, like, follow, share, subscribe, ring the bell. Also, feel free to check out my website here, check out my podcast. This is where I respectively write about movies and talk about them. So, let's just dig into this, shall we? So I've always counted myself among the fans of the Scream franchise. I've always been sort of very fond of it. And the reason why I'm here actually is because Scream 7, a film that I kind of sort of desperately want to learn how to like, even though I don't. I've recorded a video on this and I wrote an article on this as well. So Scream 7 recently crossed the $200 million mark in worldwide box office receipts, and now I think it's kind of just parked at just about 210, 211, maybe just under 212 million globally, which is something. This is the biggest sort of financial turnover for any movie in this franchise, and I suppose this is worth talking about. In fact, I actually did write an article on this, on the subject of what this video is about, but I kind of did it on vibes. You know, like, I looked at some of the numbers, but I kind of mostly did it on vibes and tried to concentrate on maybe some of the cultural reasons why certain things are and certain things aren't. And actually, I'm going to get to them somewhere further down the line. But I decided to dig a little bit deeper into this to actually tease out if there is a little bit more to say about whether the Scream franchise is kind of unique, and my sort of take on this that it is, and perhaps why that could be, right? So... in that spirit, well, I brought receipts. I mean, like, these are not real receipts. Actually, these are just props. These are just, these are real receipts, but they're not the receipts. They have nothing to do with what we're going to do today. But yeah, let's dig into this, shall we? So let's do some pseudoscience. To the spreadsheet mobile. So in order to kind of have a conversation about whether the Scream franchise is or isn't unique, you kind of have to set the terms for the conversation you're about to have with yourself. First of all, like the initial assumption for any of the pseudoscience I did using Excel spreadsheets, right? So the initial sort of condition for the discussion I set up for myself was the assumption that the Scream franchise is a slasher franchise. You want to kind of examine that movie and the 7 movies in that series in the context of other slashers. So, and this is kind of where you kind of have to start thinking, like, what's going to be the data set I'm going to compare this against? So, like, arguably, you can just think of a good handful of real classic, iconic horror series, such as Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. These would be the big ones, right? And also there's some tail, like Hellraiser, Hatchet, loads, and like Wrong Turn. Like there's a bunch, okay? However, for the purposes of this conversation, like, you kind of need to set some kind of a bar, right? Because the Scream movies have all released theatrically. They all have recorded worldwide box office returns. So you kind of have to just be honest with yourself and say, well, maybe comparing something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as a whole against this is kind of sort of unfair, because some franchises, they become like unsuccessful halfway through their sort of their lifetime, and they almost forgo cinematic releases altogether. Like the Children of the Corn franchise went direct to TV or direct to video like halfway through the 90s, or even like just in the early 90s. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre films, with the exception of the early 2000s remake, they actually then began going to direct-to-video, and some of the recent ones went direct to Netflix. Child's Play had very limited cinematic runs, like Hellraiser went direct-to-video very early on, so you kind of have to be honest with yourself. So I thought then sort of like you kind of have to focus on like as the background on, let's just say, the three big ones: Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Meanwhile, everything else we can kind of sort of bin for the time being, okay? So in that spirit, let's just have a look at, let's just say, the canonical horror franchise, the big daddy, the big granddaddy of it all. I mean, there's more around that time, but say this is the most iconic. If you think slasher films, you think Halloween, right? So if you look at its sort of box office returns across different installments, so on the sort of bar graph, you'll see financial results of all the movies in the franchise. So you'll see the first one here with $70 million, which, like, and this is unadjusted for inflation, by the way, because adjusting this for inflation would require me to do much more work, and I wasn't prepared to do that at all. But yeah, let's just focus on that. So this was the most successful indie movie of its time at the time, and you can see that right after that, that the franchise kind of took a dive. You can kind of see there's a downward trend slashing all through the subsequent sequels: Halloween 2, Season of the Witch, The Curse, The Return, the whatever of Michael Myers, with a few blips. Right, so you see Halloween H2O is a kind of revival of the series, and then the following Halloween Resurrection drops off once again. Then Rob Zombie takes over the franchise and reboots it formally, and then the same thing happens. The first one becomes a success, and the second one drops off. And then David Gordon Green takes over in 2018. Disregards essentially everything apart from the original, and essentially just delivers, I want to say, the most financially successful slasher of all time, because this thing stands at like just about $200 million of raw receipts globally, and I think this is the most, like, unadjusted for inflation, once again, this is the most successful slasher you'll probably find, right? But the sequels, again, taper off quite rapidly, and at this point you might want to then factor in, the COVID pandemic happened, and also people's viewing habits changed at the same time. But let's just disregard this for a while and just treat it sort of in absence of this. The more sort of variables you introduce into this, the more complex the picture becomes, and the more difficult it will be to tease out anything useful, right? So you can see that the sort of Halloween franchise behaves in such a way that sort of the original kind of sets the tone, and immediately the popularity tapers off, and then with each subsequent revival, which is a remake, a nostalgia remake, or a legacy sequel, the pattern sort of repeats. Like you can kind of see that here. This also tracks if you look at, let's just say, ticket sales, right? And by the way, an important caveat in here, because global sort of box office numbers would require you to find global average ticket prices, and these numbers are only kind of sort of available for the last couple of years, or there are gaping holes in the data. It's kind of hard to kind of tease out really the perfect picture of it all. So what I did was I made a few important assumptions. I know. Like, if you assume too much, you make an ass out of you and me, okay? But I made an assumption that, say, based on the couple of recent years, where you get this of the ratio between the American ticket sale and the global ticket sale, and you compare the American box office and the global box office, and you'll be able to say, this is roughly the ratio between the two. Then you can kind of sort of tease out, based on the US ticket prices which are available, you can then take that number and calculate what could potentially be, based on the recent years, the average ticket price globally across different years. But this comes with important caveats, because it disregards the split between the US and global and worldwide box office across different movies, because that will vary. So we assume that it doesn't matter, and sometimes the differences between the US and the global the global ticket price may fluctuate depending on different economic factors, okay? But for that reason, let's just disregard it. And if you look at the sort of the graph, you can kind of see, the admissions kind of sort of track with box office. So we might as well just go with box office numbers if we really want to be, just to make our lives a little bit easier, okay? So, and if you look at different franchises like Friday the 13th, same deal. The original becomes a success and the popularity tapers off and then gets revivified with either a remake or a crossover with Freddy versus Jason. So these will be the most successful entries in the franchise as a whole, right? The same goes for for A Nightmare on Elm Street. Although in here the picture is a little bit more complicated, even though you can see the downward trend and then the revival with the sort of modern remake of the original. But you can see that the picture is kind of slightly more complicated because the third one and the fourth one were kind of sort of quite a bit more popular than the third and the fourth movies in sort of the Friday the 13th or the Halloween franchise, right? But you can see that even though there is a downward trend, it's a little bit more complicated, right? So how does the Scream franchise look against all sort of these patterns that we've just noticed in the Halloween, the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises, right? Like if you look at the Scream franchise, you can see that these patterns are gone. It just looks different. And it also still tracks if you look at admissions, right? You can see that the first 3 installments in the series are kind of bringing in flat amount of money, like 170 something million dollars worldwide a piece. Okay, they don't taper off, they retain their audience. Well, they retain the money they make. The audience may be slightly tapering off because the global ticket prices are going up, but you can see that the trend is not there. You don't see the original being massively successful and then people lose interest. You see sustained interest in the franchise across the first 3. The dip kind of comes in with Scream 4, which was, let's just say, infamously or famously kind of unsuccessful somewhere in the 2010, 2011. People didn't turn up for that. But you can see with Scream 5, 6, and 7, the popularity actually started to increase. So you can see a slightly downward trend in admissions, but more nearly flat box office returns. And after the 5 Cream, Scream 5, that's how I like to call it, by the way, 5 Cream. After Scream 5, you can see a growing interest in the series, right? Which just completely flies in the face of that sort of slasher template, right? Of let's just say, people losing interest in the series. So, overall, you can almost see that the series kind of just maintains a slightly upward trend in terms of popularity and box office returns, right? So it doesn't look like, just compared the two, it doesn't look like Halloween, like at all. It doesn't look like Friday the 13th at all again. So what does it look like? Does it look like a slasher? Probably. We have to just look a little bit further out. We have to look past slashers, look at different, let's just say, long-running, successful horror franchises. Like Final Destination is a long-running, still alive franchise. You have Insidious, you have Paranormal Activity, you have Saw, and let's just say you have to remember about the Conjureverse. And I'm specifically calling it the Conjureverse because I don't like to call it a franchise. Because underneath that franchise, you can actually see there's like a trio of franchises, micro franchises, because you have the Conjuring proper, you have Annabelle, you have the Nun, and you actually have like all other sort of tangential bits to it, right? So, just for cleanliness, for the sake of cleanliness, let's just disregard that and focus on these 4. Let's focus on Final Destination, Insidious, Paranormal Activity, and so on. See what they look like, and see whether we can see a little bit more so familiarity with what Scream looked like, okay, in terms of these sort of box office trends. So if you look at Final Destination and Insidious, what you'll see is a growing trend in box office returns. You'll see, actually, this is more familiar. If you looked at this sort of the Scream franchise, this actually looks a little bit more at home. Like Final Destination kind of hovered nearly, I don't know, anywhere between $100 and $200 million, and the recent one, Bloodlines, made a crap ton of money. Insidious is just baseline a growing franchise, as in like nearly each one of these sort of entries makes more money than the previous one. So they all kind of display a growing trend. If you look at Saw, the situation is a little bit more complex because you can see there are a little bit more ups and downs, but if you average this out, it kind of just averages out to kind of sort of flat. As in, this is a reliable moneymaker that just brings in, on average, just $100 million a pop. maybe with exception of like Spiral, and I think Saw 6 wasn't really that successful. Although Saw 6 wasn't successful because of the other franchise that's to the right of it, which is Paranormal Activity, because in the same year, in 2009, Paranormal Activity 1 was released on the same day as Saw 6, and this people just decided to go to see Paranormal Activity because there was more hype behind it. So that's kind of sort of how Saw 6 didn't end up earning as much money as the previous one did, even though it would have been on course to just bring in, again, reliably $100 million, right? But if you look at Paranormal Activity, well, this is kind of like an edge case scenario, or like a borderline scenario, because you can see there's, I don't know, let's just say it makes flat amount of money for the first three installments, and then it takes a dive, and to the tune that, say, the seventh one isn't even on the graph in here because it was released straight to streaming, so it doesn't really have any box office record to speak of. But you can see that the downward trend isn't as profound as in, say, in the case of like Friday the 13th or Halloween, right? So it actually already becomes a little bit closer to what Scream is, even though these two franchises are not slasher franchises, right? So where is Scream in all this? That's the question, right? Like, how does it, like, where are we here? Like, we have slashers on the left and these kind of movies on the right, and you can kind of see that the numbers doesn't really jive very well, at least visually speaking, when it comes to like looking at these graphs, and you see these sort of downward trends on one end and growing trends on the other. Where is Scream in this? So in order to kind of just maybe parse this a little bit better, let's just take visuals out of the equation and convert them to some kind of numericals. Maybe that will kind of just make it a little bit easier. So if you look at Halloween once again, because this is the longest running franchise I think I have in this data set, it has just a number of entries, so it's easier to kind of look at, and as a good example. And if you look at, say, I don't know, pick a few data points, pick Halloween, pick H2O, pick Rob Zombie, and pick the David Gordon Green one. But yeah, you can do this, like you have to do this for all of them, and take the admissions ratio between the original and any sequel in the series. You'll get what I would call the retention ratio. And if you average them, then what you'll get is what I would call franchise efficiency index. Okay? And for Halloween, it kind of just boils down to just about 0.35, which means that on average, each sequel in the Halloween franchise brings in 35% of the original audience that came out to see the original in 1978. Okay? If you take all these franchises that we've just looked at, so all the slashers that we looked at, and even the ones that we didn't, and all the other horror franchises like Final Destination, Saw, and Paranormal Activity, and whatever, and if you compare the numbers for them, so if you calculate all of these franchise efficiency indexes for them, what you'll see is slashers kind of just stays kind of sort of between 0.3 and 0.5, with one exception, actually, because A Nightmare on Elm Street kind of behaves slightly different because it's a shorter franchise with a massive outlier in the form of the 2009 remake. So you kind of get that reboot bump. If you take it out of the equation, then it kind of drops to just about 0.51. And on the other hand, what you have is what I would call the concept/gimmick region, which kind of boils down to the franchise efficiency index being between 0.7 and 1, okay? And 1 being, by the way, so if franchise efficiency index is 1, that means every sequel brings in the exact same amount of people to see this movie, which means the franchise is effectively buoyant. When it comes to box office, it actually may grow because there are inflationary pressures on ticket prices, which means they will grow over time. So if you bring in the same amount of people over time, but the ticket prices are going up, then you'll be bringing more money in real terms, okay? And what you also have is the region above 1, which means de facto growth, as in each sequel brings in more than the original. And this is kind of the only example in here, realistically speaking, that I have in this data set will be in Insidious, okay? But where is Scream in this? Because it doesn't necessarily have that sort of low index the way slashers do, and it doesn't really have that high index or that sort of these concept/gimmick movies like Final Destination or torture porn or found footage movies tend to have, okay? It doesn't have that. It kind of sits somewhere in between. But maybe even the index itself that I came up with maybe is kind of imperfect, because you have to be sort of realistic, because like I like to see Scream franchise as a slasher, but comparing it to something like Halloween feels a little bit unfair, because, you know, Halloween and Scream are kind of different. First of all, Halloween's been around for way longer than Scream and has produced way more movies, right? It's essentially twice as big. It kind of feels like it's almost unfair, because the longer the franchise runs, the more you'll find these sort of diminishing returns on audience coming back would be more pronounced, right? So how about let's just introduce some weighting into this sort of operation, and so that the early sequels would matter more than the later ones. Okay, so if we have this sort of the tapering effect towards the sort of, let's just say, the latter entries in the franchise, they wouldn't matter all as just as much. And conversely, massive growth or these massive blips would also be normalized down. Okay, so if you go and look at these numbers once again, franchise efficiency index non-weighted in blue and weighted in orange, you kind of see slight correction in certain places, like Halloween slightly less effective, Child's Play slightly more effective, Scream slightly more effective, and Saw quite a bit more effective. So based on this, I kind of want to divide all these these movies in terms of how they behave into essentially like three different classes. The puncture tire movies, where you inflate, you run over a nail, and the air kind of slowly drains, pressure just escapes from this franchise. The sort of inflated balloons, where you put air in them and they will just stay the way they are unless messed around with. And hot air balloons, ones that someone effectively puts more energy into and makes them go up and up and up and higher and higher and higher, right? Okay? Again, where's Scream in all this, right? Scream kind of sits in between that sort of puncture tire and that sort of inflatable balloon. And you can kind of sort of maybe understand how that is happening, because if you go back to the sort of admissions versus box office, you'll see there is kind of like a drop off in people going out to see it, even though they're now increasing in numbers. But you can kind of sort of see that Scream franchise has reached this sort of weird escape velocity that sort of the ticket price inflation effectively counteracts any losses in actual butts in seats over the course of, I want to say now, 3 decades, because of that increased ticket price. But it kind of sits in between the two. And now the question is why, okay? The question why Scream franchise behaves the way it does, as in it retains audience and retains box office receipts, unlike any slasher film, but much more like gimmick-based movies, maybe kind of speaks to the fact that it isn't a slasher franchise in the first place. And I know this is kind of like, maybe this is a provocative statement, but let's just think about, what does a horror film need to be considered a slasher? So first of all, what it needs to have is an iconic villain, an iconic weapon, a cast of would-be victims, and a final girl. These are like the 4 things that usually kind of recur across all these different franchises. It has, well, it doesn't have to be a girl, but it usually is a girl, right? But it has to have a villain like Michael Myers, like Jason Voorhees, like Freddy Krueger. Like, it has to have a weapon associated with it, you know, like the glove, the love glove, the knife, the machete, the chainsaw, you know, and at the same time you kind of have, well, and when it comes to the sort of the cast of would-be victims, there are also certain rules that this movie needs to follow, as in like, well, like having sex is a problem, so there's the virginal sort of idea that the final girl is the one that doesn't have sex and whatever. Like there's like a whole sort of culture around who dies and when and how and why, and at the same time there are rules as to how the final girl is revealed, and how the franchise is sustained by the final girl either coming back or not coming back. But they actually have to have one. And in that spirit, like, Alien is a slasher film in space, because you have an iconic villain. The weapon is the mouthy thing. You have like the sort of the all passengers of the Nostromo, and you have the emergence of Ripley as the final girl. It essentially follows a slasher template. It's a haunted house slasher in space. Okay, it's Halloween in space. With all that in mind, what does Scream have? It has an iconic weapon, the knife. It has the Ghostface killer, that would be the iconic killer. It has the final girl, Neve Campbell is the final girl. And it has a cast of would-be victims, because there's always a bunch of people that are kind of involved in the process. However, each of these things can be contested to some extent, because first of all, and this is one of the main reasons why I think Scream is kind of special in this regard, because Ghostface is not a killer. Ghostface is an avatar. It's a mask. Every single movie in the franchise is essentially a Scooby-Doo type mystery, where one of the main goals is to figure out who in the cast of the characters that we have been introduced somewhere in the beginning of the movie is the killer. And it's kind of the job of the main characters, and our job as the viewer is to kind of just figure out who this person is. Okay, who's the killer? That's one of the main driving forces of the movie, and that's not something that you'll see in something like Halloween. It's not something that you'll see in Friday the 13th. Although there's one where they introduced a copycat killer, you always kind of know what to expect, because the killer is something that comes back, usually from the dead. Mikey Madison in Scream 5 actually made a comment on this. Right? She says well, the Stab series doesn't have a recurring villain. That's why it's unsuccessful. And I'm just saying, the Stab series and the Scream series is essentially a de facto stand-in for. It's like a meta commentary on its own existence. But it's kind of like a stand-in for the Scream franchise as a whole. And I think sorry, Mikey, I kind of wholeheartedly disagree. I would actually say that the reason why this series is as successful as it is because it doesn't have a villain that needs to be brought back from the dead. It's not burdened by mythos and, reverse exorcism, pagan rituals, that kind of shit. It doesn't have any of this, okay? All it is a Scooby-Doo mystery. You have to invent progressively more ridiculous ideas about who's going to be the killer, but you don't have the associated fantasy trying to explain it. So you don't have this sort of the organically growing sort of barnacles of plot and world building just around the whole of the franchise, which I think is what helps this franchise stay buoyant, because you don't come back to see it for the simple pleasures of seeing people cut with a knife as much as it is a pleasure when you watch a horror film. Because one of the reasons is to find out who the new killer would be. What is gonna happen now? Okay. Another one is the final girl is not really a single final girl. I know Neve Campbell is the sort of the Scream Queen of the 90s, and now kind of the resurrected Scream Queen, right? But the Scream series had more than one sort of main character, because it had Gail Weathers, which was Courtney Cox's character. It had Neve Campbell, sort of Sidney Prescott, and also had Dewey. Okay, Dewey bit the dust in the Scream 5, but it had more than one character that you can come back to. It actually almost functioned like a family kind of saga, like Star Wars almost, right? Where if in the absence of one, you can have the other, and sometimes they would also, because they have a dynamic between each other, you can kind of see a reinforcing sort of synergistic effect between them. So you don't have one character that needs to be revisited, and one person that every single time the killer wants to track down and murder. You have more, okay? So there's more people to come back to and cherish, okay? And the cast of would-be victims is also a cast of people who aid in the second reason why I think this movie is, or this whole franchise is special, because they kind of help the movie function as a meta commentary on the series as a whole, or meta commentary on the idea of a horror franchise as a whole. Because this is where you see the guy Randy, who's in the cast of would-be victims, explaining the rules of a slasher, telling everyone why they should or shouldn't do certain things, because the alternative is either dying in a basement all alone, or surviving till the end, or at least until the final girl shows up, okay? And in sort of the later installments, you kind of see how this is where the information about the franchise, how the meta commentary functions in the franchise, comes out of people who are in the crowd. Not necessarily in like among the 2 or 3 people that are kind of like the core cast. You have 3 out of 4 that kind of contested. The only thing that really ties this movie to a slasher sort of tradition is the knife. Because everything else you can kind of sort of say, well, actually, Ghostface is not a person. well, actually, the cast of characters is quite a bit more. Well, actually, we don't have a single final girl. We have more final characters, okay? So it doesn't really behave like a slasher franchise. It behaves a little bit more like a gimmick franchise because it's not necessarily about one guy coming back from the dead. It's about a whole concept. The formula is what you come back to. The Scooby-Doo, the meta commentary, and the multiple people, which is kind of sort of like, well, Final Destination is kind of like a concept slasher taken to the extreme because it was concocted out of the idea of how about we take out the slasher villain altogether and replace him with a disembodied or discorporated sort of villain. You don't have a villain in there. What you have is a formula of you're introduced to a bunch of characters in a vision, or you're introduced to a bunch of characters, then a vision happens, and then in that vision they all die, and then we come out of this vision, and then something happens to disrupt the future proceedings, and then death takes these people out one by one. I don't know, in the order of how they should have died in the first place. And the final girl or the final person in the movie is revealed through being able to cheat death. Okay? So it's not about coming back to a guy coming back from the dead with a knife or a machete or a chainsaw. It's about coming back to a concept. Because every single one of them really realistically has a new cast of characters, and the sort of the tethers between them are usually the background characters. So that's kind of how Final Destination and Scream have a lot in common in that way. And if you think about further out, like, you know, people came back to see Saw movies for the carnage, like for the exhilaration, for the roller coaster ride of seeing these Rube Goldberg machines of death and mutilation. And actually, for the same reason, they would have probably come to see Final Destination movies, because they were kind of more, let's just say, people-friendly Rube Goldberg death and carnage machines, less gross and less, let's just say, demanding when it comes to taste for, call it, more visceral kind of entertainment. But you can kind of see that, you know, like a movie like this doesn't necessarily retain the same people. Maybe it does, but they don't come back to see the killer. I mean, we could question this and say, like, maybe they come back for the Jigsaw killer. I don't know, maybe. But I think the main driving force is, I wonder what's going to happen this time that it's going to gross me out, okay? Similarly, Final Destination. But you can kind of see that Scream kind of sits in the middle, because it has elements of a traditional slasher, and it has elements of a gimmick horror. And it kind of finds a middle ground between them. So you can kind of see that between the idea of being a Scooby-Doo mystery and being a meta commentary on its own existence, and also having the sort of the familial sort of saga-esque relationship with the concept of a final girl, it kind of becomes more of like a platform movie. You don't come back necessarily to... You do come back for Neve Campbell and Courtney Cox, but you equally come back to find out who the new killer is. There's also... like the fourth reason, which maybe slightly more political when it comes to Scream 7, that you kind of have to sort of disentangle from it, and I think it's impossible at this point, because due to all these scandals associated with the production of Scream 7, which I talked about in my previous video, and I actually did write a little bit about in my article, links below, you'll see that maybe there is a non-zero probability that part of the box office driving Scream 7 to becoming the most sort of financially successful movie in the franchise could be political, as in, like, a fraction of the audience could go and see this because they want to own the libs, if that makes any sense. Although I refuse to believe that this would be the main driving force, but I think at this point I don't feel comfortable disregarding it altogether. But that, you can almost put that to the side, because the three main reasons I think are sufficient to kind of tell you that the franchise is kind of sort of special. And actually, if you look at its like financial results, you know, if you look at what this movie looked like across, like, financially in terms of admissions, again with the caveat of trying to calculate this, you know, ticket prices. So bear in mind that these numbers may be a little bit off, because I didn't have the time or the inclination to actually spend hours and hours and days looking up ticket prices from different decades, from different countries, and trying to average them out, because I think data like this doesn't really exist in any sort of coherent way. But if you look at how this franchise does financially against all other franchises, it actually is just as successful as Saw, with fewer entries, and it dwarfs every single one of slasher franchises, unadjusted for inflation. When you adjust for inflation, it will become different, right? Because it's $1 billion franchise, right? Paranormal Activity is just under $1 billion, right? And at the same time, remember that the Conjuring franchise, the Conjureverse, has made like in excess of $3 billion. So it's just like way up there. So it's almost besides, like it's just outside of our conversation. It's just so massively successful, you know? So it counts for something. So in combination with all these sort of aspects, you know, like seeing how massively successful the franchise is and why, I think it's fair to say that Scream movies are kind of special. So if you disagree or agree with me, feel free to leave a comment. Tell me what you think about this, because I sometimes get shit wrong, okay? But I think I'm onto something, okay? I think the Scream franchise is worth talking about in the context of the history of horror films or the cultural trends as they are, because it kind of stands apart. It's not the best, the most successful thing ever, but it's special. You know, because it kind of sits in the twilight zone between slashers and everything else. It kind of just shows you, it denudes the limitations of a typical slasher by refusing to be one, while also pretending to be one too. It's a weird sort of place to be, but I think this is kind of what makes it kind of sort of unique. Okay, so again, if you disagree or agree with me, leave a comment below, and follow, like, share, subscribe, do all the things, and see you on the next one.